Sometimes the person who saves your life is the one you'd never expect to notice you at all. What you're about to hear is a story that proves guardian angels don't always wear wings. Sometimes they wear hospital uniforms and carry mops instead of halos. This is a true account of how one woman's courage and sharp eyes saved a life, exposed a deadly conspiracy, and reminded an entire family what really matters when everything else falls away. Margaret Thompson had built her empire from nothing. At 55, she was the CEO of Thompson Medical Corporation, one of the largest hospital chains on the East Coast. Her company operated 42 hospitals across 15 states, employed over 30,000 people, and generated billions in revenue. Margaret was known in boardrooms from New York to Miami as a tough negotiator who could close any deal and solve any problem. But there was one problem Margaret couldn't solve, one deal she couldn't negotiate, and one battle she was losing despite all her wealth and power. Her 17-year-old daughter Emily was dying, and all the money in the world couldn't seem to save her. Emily had been the light of Margaret's life since the day she was born. After Margaret's divorce 10 years earlier, Emily had become not just her daughter but her closest companion and greatest source of joy. They would spend weekends together exploring art museums, trying new restaurants, and planning Emily's future. Emily wanted to be a pediatric nurse, inspired by the compassionate care she'd witnessed during her grandmother's final illness. 6 months ago, Emily had started experiencing severe headaches and dizzy spells. What began as occasional episodes quickly escalated into debilitating symptoms that left the vibrant teenager bedridden for days at a time. Margaret had taken Emily to the best specialists in the country, but test after test came back inconclusive. The symptoms were getting worse, and Emily was growing weaker by the day. Finally, Dr. Harrison Webb, the chief neurologist at St. Mary's Medical Center in Manhattan, had admitted Emily for extensive testing and observation. St. Mary's wasn't part of Margaret's hospital network, but it had the best neurology department in the city, and Margaret would do anything to help her daughter. For 3 weeks, Emily had been a patient at St. Mary's while doctors ran every conceivable test. Margaret had taken a leave of absence from her company to stay by Emily's bedside, watching helplessly as her beautiful daughter grew pale and weak despite the round-the-clock medical care. The doctors were baffled. Emily's symptoms didn't match any known condition, and her blood work showed inconsistencies that couldn't be explained. Some days she would seem to improve slightly, giving Margaret hope, but then she would relapse and become even sicker than before. Margaret had spared no expense in Emily's care. She'd hired private nurses, brought in consulting specialists from across the country, and even had Emily's room upgraded to a luxurious private suite on the hospital's VIP floor. But money couldn't buy the one thing Margaret desperately needed: answers. Enter Rosa Martinez, a woman whose story couldn't have been more different from Margaret's, but whose path was about to intersect with theirs in the most crucial way possible. Rosa was 42 years old and had been working as a night shift custodian at St. Mary's Medical Center for 8 years. She had immigrated to New York from El Salvador 12 years earlier with her husband Carlos and their 2 young children, seeking the American dream and fleeing the violence that had claimed too many of their neighbors back home. Carlos worked construction during the day while Rosa cleaned offices and hospitals at night. Together, they barely made enough to cover rent on their small apartment in Queens, but they were proud of the honest living they'd built and the opportunities they were creating for their children. Rosa's job at the hospital wasn't glamorous, but she took pride in her work. She understood that a clean environment could mean the difference between life and death for patients, and she treated every room she entered with the respect it deserved. Over the years, she developed relationships with many of the long-term patients, offering kind words and gentle encouragement during their darkest hours. What most people didn't know about Rosa was that she'd been a nurse in El Salvador before coming to America. She'd worked in a small rural clinic for 5 years, helping deliver babies and caring for patients with limited resources but unlimited compassion. Her nursing credentials hadn't transferred to the United States, and starting over in a new country with a new language had forced her to take whatever work she could find. But Rosa had never lost her medical instincts or her deep care for those who were suffering. On the night that would change everything, Rosa was assigned to clean the VIP floor where Emily Thompson lay fighting for her life. It was her first time working that section of the hospital, as the regular custodian had called in sick. Rosa entered Emily's room quietly, not wanting to disturb the sleeping teenager or her mother, who had fallen asleep in the bedside chair after another long day of watching and waiting. The room was dimly lit by medical monitors and the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the large windows. As Rosa began her careful cleaning routine, she noticed something that made her pause. Emily's 4-bag, which contained the medications and nutrients that were supposedly helping her recover, had an unusual appearance. The liquid inside seemed slightly cloudier than normal, with what looked like tiny particles floating near the bottom. Rosa had seen thousands of 4-bags during her nursing career in El Salvador. She knew what they should look like, and this one didn't look right. Her first instinct was to dismiss her concerns. After all, she was just a custodian now. The doctors and nurses at this prestigious hospital certainly knew what they were doing. Who was she to question their medical judgment? But as Rosa continued cleaning, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Emily looked so young and vulnerable in the hospital bed, reminding Rosa of her own daughter Sophia. The thought of any child suffering unnecessarily made her heart ache. Rosa moved closer to examine the 4-bag more carefully, being careful not to disturb the sleeping family. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The liquid in the bag contained what appeared to be a fine sediment that definitely shouldn't be there. More alarming, the bag itself had a small puncture mark near the top that looked like it had been made by a needle, but it wasn't in the right place for normal medical access. Rosa's nursing instincts kicked into overdrive. Someone had tampered with Emily's 4-bag. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This sweet girl wasn't suffering from some mysterious illness, she was being slowly poisoned. Rosa's hands trembled as she processed the implications. If she was right, Emily's life was in immediate danger. But if she was wrong, she could lose her job, face legal consequences, and destroy her family's financial stability. Speaking up would mean challenging the medical authority of doctors and nurses with far more credentials and status than she had. For several agonizing minutes, Rosa stood frozen with indecision. The safe thing would be to finish her cleaning and leave. No one would blame her for staying in her lane and not getting involved. But as Rosa looked at Emily's pale face and heard her labored breathing, she thought about her own children sleeping safely at home. She thought about the oath she'd taken as a young nurse in El Salvador to do no harm and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Rosa couldn't stay silent. She gently touched Margaret's shoulder, waking her from her exhausted sleep. Margaret startled, looking confused and alarmed to see the custodian standing by her daughter's bed. "Ma'am," Rosa said softly, her English heavily accented but clear. "I am very sorry to wake you, but I think there is something wrong with your daughter's 4." Margaret's first reaction was irritation. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and in no mood to deal with what seemed like an intrusion from hospital staff. "I'm sure the nurses know what they're doing," she replied curtly. "Please just finish your work so we can rest." But Rosa didn't back down. "Please, ma'am. I was a nurse in my country. This 4-bag, it does not look right. I think someone has put something in it that should not be there." Margaret's irritation quickly turned to alarm as she registered the seriousness in Rosa's voice. She stood up and looked at the 4-bag herself, but to her untrained eye, it looked the same as all the others Emily had received over the past 3 weeks. "What do you mean?" Rosa asked, her voice still respectful but urgent. "What do you see?" Rosa pointed to the cloudy sediment and the small puncture mark. "In El Salvador, I see this before. When someone wants to hurt patient, they inject things into 4-bag. This bag has been opened by needle, and there are particles that should not be there." Margaret's world tilted on its axis. Could it be possible that someone was deliberately harming Emily? The idea seemed insane, but it would explain why her daughter kept getting sicker despite receiving the best medical care money could buy. "Are you absolutely certain?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I cannot be 100% certain without testing," Rosa replied honestly. "But in my heart, as a mother and as someone who has cared for many patients, I believe your daughter is being poisoned." Margaret's mind raced through the implications. If Rosa was right, every moment Emily continued receiving the 4 was a moment closer to disaster. But if Rosa was wrong, stopping the four could also endanger Emily's life. What should we do? Margaret asked, surprised to find herself seeking advice from the custodian she'd barely acknowledged moments before. We must stop the four now and call for doctor to test the bag, Rosa said firmly. Your daughter's life may depend on it. Margaret didn't hesitate. She reached over and clamped the four line, stopping the flow of liquid into her daughter's bloodstream. Then she pressed the call button for the nurse. Within minutes, the room was filled with medical staff responding to Margaret's emergency call. The night nurse, Jennifer Walsh, seemed surprised and somewhat annoyed to find Margaret and Rosa standing by the clamped four. Mrs. Thompson, why did you stop Emily's four? Jennifer asked, moving to restart the flow. Don't touch that, Margaret said sharply. I want this four bag tested immediately. I have reason to believe it's been tampered with. Jennifer looked skeptical. Ma'am, I understand you're worried about Emily, but stopping her four could be dangerous. She needs these medications and nutrients. Rosa stepped forward, her voice quiet but determined. Please, miss. Look at the bag carefully. See the small hole near the top? See the cloudy particles at the bottom? This is not normal. Jennifer examined the bag more closely, and her expression changed from skepticism to concern. She'd been a nurse for 15 years and had never seen anything quite like what Rosa was describing. I'll call Dr. Webb immediately, Jennifer said, her professional demeanor taking over. We'll have the lab run a full analysis on this bag. Within an hour, the hospital was in chaos. The lab results confirmed Rosa's suspicions in the most horrifying way possible. Emily's four bag contained a slow-acting toxin that had been gradually building up in her system over the past 3 weeks, creating symptoms that mimicked a neurological disorder while slowly shutting down her organs. Dr. Webb was devastated. He'd been treating Emily's symptoms without realizing she was being systematically poisoned. The toxin was sophisticated enough that it wouldn't show up in standard blood tests, explaining why Emily's condition had been so mysterious. The hospital immediately began administering antidotes and treatments to flush the toxin from Emily's system. Security was called, and a full investigation was launched to determine who had access to Emily's four bags and could have tampered with them. The truth, when it emerged, was more shocking than anyone had imagined. Dr. Richard Stanton, one of the attending physicians on Emily's case, had been systematically poisoning her as part of an elaborate revenge scheme against Margaret. 3 years earlier, Margaret's Hospital Corporation had acquired a smaller hospital chain, and Dr. Stanton had lost his position as chief of staff in the restructuring. He'd blamed Margaret personally for what he saw as the destruction of his career and had been planning his revenge ever since. When Emily was admitted to St. Mary's, Dr. Stanton saw an opportunity to make Margaret suffer the way he believed she'd made him suffer. His plan was diabolic in its sophistication. By slowly poisoning Emily with a toxin that created neurological symptoms, he could watch Margaret spend millions on medical care while her daughter grew sicker. He intended to let the poisoning continue until Emily's death, knowing that Margaret would live with the guilt of being unable to save her only child. Dr. Stanton was arrested within 24 hours of Rosa's discovery. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including security footage showing him accessing Emily's room at unusual hours and needle marks on multiple four bags. But the real miracle was Emily's recovery. Within 48 hours of stopping the poisoned four, Emily began showing signs of improvement. The antidote treatments were working, and her body was fighting back against months of toxin exposure. Her headaches subsided, her strength returned, and her vibrant personality emerged from the fog of illness that had clouded it for so long. A week later, Emily was sitting up in bed, laughing with her mother for the first time in months. The doctors were amazed by her rapid recovery, calling it nothing short of miraculous. Margaret knew the real miracle had been Rosa's courage and medical instincts. When Emily was finally discharged from the hospital, Margaret asked to speak with Rosa privately. She found her in the hospital's break room at the end of her shift, looking tired but relieved that Emily was going home healthy. Rosa, Margaret began, struggling to find words adequate for what this woman had done for her family. I don't know how to thank you for saving my daughter's life. If you hadn't spoken up. She couldn't finish the sentence. They both knew Emily would have died if Rosa hadn't risked her job and reputation to voice her concerns. "I am just happy Emily is well," Rosa replied simply. "That is all the thanks I need." But Margaret wasn't finished. Over the next few days, she learned more about Rosa's background. She discovered that Rosa had been a skilled nurse in El Salvador, that she was working multiple jobs to support her family, and that her children were excelling in school despite the family's financial struggles. Margaret also learned that Rosa had been sending part of her small salary back to El Salvador to help fund a small clinic in her hometown, the same clinic where she'd once worked as a nurse. 2 weeks after Emily's discharge, Margaret called Rosa and asked her to meet at a coffee shop near the hospital. Rosa was nervous, wondering if there might be some legal complications from her involvement in exposing the poisoning plot. Instead, Margaret presented Rosa with an offer that would change her life forever. Margaret said, "I've been thinking about what you did for Emily, and I want to do something for you. I've looked into your nursing credentials from El Salvador, and I believe we can get them recognized here in the United States. I'd like to pay for you to take the courses and exams you need to become a licensed nurse in New York." Rosa was speechless. The cost of nursing certification was far beyond what her family could afford, and she'd accepted years ago that her nursing career was behind her. But Margaret wasn't finished. "Once you're licensed, I'd like to offer you a position as head of patient advocacy at Thompson Medical Corporation. Your job would be to ensure that patients receive compassionate, attentive care and that their voices are heard even when they can't speak for themselves." Rosa began to cry, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Margaret was offering. "There's one more thing," Margaret continued. "I want to fund the clinic in El Salvador that you've been supporting. Emily and I would like to establish a foundation that provides medical care and education in underserved communities, starting with your hometown." Rosa couldn't speak through her tears, but her heart was overflowing with gratitude and disbelief. 6 months later, Rosa Martinez was working as a licensed nurse and patient advocate at Thompson Medical Corporation. Her first initiative was implementing a program where all hospital staff, regardless of their position, were trained to recognize signs of patient distress and empowered to speak up when something didn't seem right. The Rosa Martinez Patient Protection Protocol, as it came to be known, was eventually adopted by hospitals across the Thompson network and then by medical facilities nationwide. It prevented countless cases of medical errors, neglect, and even deliberate harm. Rosa's children, inspired by their mother's courage and the opportunities that followed, both decided to pursue careers in medicine. Her son Miguel became a doctor, and her daughter Sophia followed in her mother's footsteps as a nurse. Emily Thompson, now healthy and thriving, decided to accelerate her plans to become a pediatric nurse. The experience of being helpless in a hospital bed had deepened her commitment to caring for sick children. She often said that Rosa had saved her life twice, once by stopping the poison, and again by showing her what it truly meant to be a healing presence in someone's darkest hour. Margaret's perspective on success and wealth changed fundamentally after Emily's ordeal. She restructured her company to prioritize patient care over profits and became a leading advocate for hospital workers' rights and recognition. She established the Rosa Martinez Scholarship Fund, which helps immigrant healthcare workers get their credentials recognized in the United States. Dr. Richard Stanton was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. His medical license was permanently revoked, and his case became a textbook study in medical ethics programs across the country. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this story is the ongoing relationship between the Thompson and Martinez families. Emily and Rosa's daughter Sophia became close friends, bonding over their shared interest in healthcare and their mother's incredible story. Margaret became like a second mother to Rosa's children, helping them with college applications and career guidance. Every year on the anniversary of the night Rosa saved Emily's life, the two families gather for dinner. They toast not just to Emily's health and Rosa's courage, but to the reminder that heroism often comes from the most unexpected places. Rosa still keeps the small flashlight she used during her custodial shifts, not because she needs it anymore, but because it reminds her that sometimes we're called to shine light into dark places, even when it's scary, even when it's not our job, even when speaking up might cost us everything. The hospital room where Emily almost died has been converted into a meditation and reflection space for families dealing with medical crises. A plaque by the door reads, "In honor of Rosa Martinez, who showed us that guardian angels sometimes carry mops instead of wings." This story teaches us that courage doesn't always roar, sometimes it whispers in accented English from someone society has trained us to overlook. It reminds us that expertise and wisdom can come from unexpected places, and that the person who saves your life might be someone you'd never think to thank. Rosa Martinez wasn't looking for recognition or reward when she decided to speak up that night. She was simply listening to her heart and trusting her instincts, even when it would have been safer to stay silent. In a world that often values credentials over character, Rosa's story proves that sometimes the most important qualifications are courage, compassion, and the willingness to act when someone's life hangs in the balance. If this story touched your heart, remember that there are Rosa Martinezes everywhere, people working quietly behind the scenes, people whose voices might be overlooked, people who might hold the key to solving problems we can't solve alone. The challenge is being humble enough to listen and brave enough to act on what we hear. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes walk among us every day. Like this video if you believe in the power of speaking up for what's right, and subscribe to Pure Kindness Stories for more tales that prove the best of humanity is alive and well in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the smallest voice carries the most important message, and sometimes the person who saves your life is the one you'd least expect to notice you at all.